Story: Girl with a Slit Throat. I stood on the porch, watching the dark mist rolling and coiling, ever present. An apparition breezed towards me. The mist tentacles twisted and turned, thorns erect, attacking the apparition. Its attempt was futile. The apparition was on a different wavelength, so it couldn't be touched. Steadily, closer, the apparition came towards the house. Behind me, my companion, Mortimer, stood at the entrance of the house, watching. The apparition rolled to the porch, crossing the threshold of the first step. A white plimsoll stepped onto the porch, followed by the leg and body of a thin girl. She was 20-something, dressed for winter, in leggings and a winter parka. Pulling back her hood, she revealed a pale face with a mop of black hair that she pushed out of her eyes. Sandra. Mortimer growled. "You can see me?" Sandra said. "My house, my rules. Please come in and take a seat. Mortimer will show you the way," I said. Sandra looked at Mortimer, who backed into the house. Sandra entered my home, her steps light on the wooden deck. I followed her. Mortimer stood at the landing to usher her into the lounge. Sandra went in and plonked herself in the armchair. She looked around the room, sizing up the wooden furnishings and book-filled shelves. Finally, her eyes set on the fireplace. She watched the flames dance on the logs for a while. I sat down. I got through a couple easily, 3 I think. Then Walt came. I felt I needed a bit of practice first, like a boxer who faces a few opponents before he faces the champion. Walt was older now, frail and easy to scare. He'd been on the job for years. His leg was giving him jip, so he hobbled around the station. It'd take so long. I watched him, give him a bit of a shove and watch him stumble. It was hilarious. Didn't bug him too much, just every now and then. Needed to get him talking to the others, telling them the station was haunted. They would look at him as if he were barking mad. Sandra grinned to herself. I followed him home one time. He lived in the dingy apartment on his own back then. The old boy was a real technophobe, so I had to use that, because that's my jam. I waited till he fell asleep, then I'd stab my thumb into his ribs. Ow! He got up and looked around. I'd holler with laughter. He could hear me, but he couldn't see me. It was hilarious. I'd keep at it, watching, waiting until he's just about to nod off, then yank, pull his ear. Ah! Poor sod, could get no rest. Sandra looked at Mortimer, who kept his eyes on her. "Your dog doesn't like me," she said. Hamish, my other companion, a ginger cat, sauntered into the room. He took one look at Sandra. He shook his head and disappeared down the landing. Not a good sign when both Mortimer and Hamish will not give you the time of day.
"Flower girl,"
a voice was heard faintly from the corridor. Who said that? Sandra looked around the room. There is only 3 of us in this room. Maybe something from your past is calling you, I said. Whatever, gatekeeper. She smiled to herself and shook her head. Now that I knew where Walt lived, I followed him back home. He shifted flats a few times over the years, but this was a new one, after a divorce. I'd be with him, both at home and at work. This one time he came home, and all his furniture was piled in his bathroom. He had to go for a wee. He was desperate, and he couldn't hold it. Ended up wetting himself. Sandra looked at the fireplace. I remained still, watching her. "Can't read you," she said. "Walt, I wasn't done with him just yet. You see, he was mine now, at his home. And I'd follow him to work, watch him. Not when others were working with him during the day, nah. When he's doing the night shift, when he was alone performing his duties like a dancing monkey. Go around, do a station check. That's when I'd have a great crack. I began with the usual stuff like appearing behind him when he's washing his hands. It frightened the pants off him. Move his cup when he wasn't looking. He spent 20 minutes looking for it. Then he'd find it exactly where he left it. Poor sod thought he was going balmy. Sandra grinned, her teeth sharpened. Only sharper daggers protruded out from beneath them. She appeared more like a shark, mouth open. I finally got to him. For 3 days straight, I battered him. As he would fall asleep, whack, he'd get a slap or a swift kick to the groin. I'd whisper his name. Walt. Walt. It was yummy. He stopped eating because I kept moving his plates when he wasn't looking. He was going to work. Slam. I tripped him. He went flying down the stairs and mashed his head on the skirting board. It was hilarious. He looked straight at me when he was lying on the floor, head bleeding. I made sure he could see me. With a click, I was gone. The sod was tough. I'd give him that. He still went to work, and I followed him. It was cold round October time. He was on nights. I let him be for a while. Let him stew. I let him be until the station closed. He'd check the waiting rooms, the toilets. I hollered his name, making him jump. I followed him back to the office. He sat down and looked at the monitors. Big time. I went and sat in the waiting room. I could sense him watching me on the monitor. His heart rate quickened. I looked at the camera and slit my own throat. Blood poured out. I died right there in front of him. I heard him gasp. I laughed so hard, I nearly wet myself. Went into the office. Walter died. He was white as a sheet. Still on the chair, eyes open, dead. Sandra crunched her hands together. She looked up at the ceiling, exposing the long scar that separated her head from her neck. Man, this place is ancient. How long has it been here? She said. It was here when I came to live here. That waiting room where you slit your own throat. Is that why you stay on the station? Sandra nodded. Took my last breath there, so don't see why not. I was actually thinking of leaving, going to someone's house, like I did with Walt. She smiled. Then I saw the new guy. He was handsome, a little older than me. He looked so much like my boyfriend in that uniform. The way he'd always have his hands in his pockets when he stood still. Didn't move much, head slightly dipped. A new station manager, starting on nights, so I stayed and watched him. His name was Han, and he was mine from the moment I saw him. Sandra's eyes widened. The edges darkened, swallowing her lenses. It looked like dark mist had seeped into her eyes. I started with the radio, white noise. I followed him around the station, occasionally whispering his name. Han. Han. I could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but he didn't look so scared, so I upped the ante. I let him finish. He closed the station, got the security call done, and then sat about in his chair, snoozing. Radio blast of white noise. He awakened. He grabbed the radio and turned the volume down, eventually getting back to sleep. Let me really freak him out, show him I'm here. I used his keyboard and typed, I see you. 1:15 a.m. Last train departed. You forgot to lock the station door. 1:20. You went to make a cup of tea. In my kitchen. 1:33. You snoozed in the chair. 1:40. Turn around. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. The printer kicked in, awakening him. He went over and read my little love note. He squashed it and tossed it in the bin, called his neighboring station and had a right go at his mate for taking the piss. "What you playing at? Trying to get some kip here. Cut it out," he said. No, he wasn't paying attention, so I had to up the ante. Han is not frail like Walt. I waited till he nodded off again, listening to some lo-fi music. I pulled the paper out of the bin and went and stuck it on the office entrance door. He'd see it when he goes to do his 3 a.m. check. When he turns, I'll show him my real face. Show him what my boyfriend did to me in the waiting room all those years ago, when there were no cameras. After all, that's why I'm here. Sandra looked at me, her eyes black. I went in the kitchen and got a chopping knife, and I waited. The mark on her neck was bleeding. "Can you see it?" I nodded. When Walt first got the manager's job, I came to give him his dinner because he forgot it at home. We'd had a Barney. He left for work early. Didn't want him to go hungry, so I brought it in. Just got the last train in and I needed a taxi back. He didn't want to pay for it. I didn't know he didn't want me to come to his work. I didn't say anything when he had a go. I just put his dinner in the mess room and went to the waiting room to keep warm because he wouldn't stop shouting at me. He came in and just looked at me. Didn't say a word. Before I knew it, he grabbed my hair and slid the knife across my throat. Sandra touched the cut on her neck. It was the first time I noticed sadness in her. He did this to me. He did this to me and got away with it. So why shouldn't I do it to them? I'm fed up of them all, not seeing me. They need to pay attention. He treated me like a lackey, and I didn't say anything, and then he did this to me. Sandra's body stretched, making her appear gaunt and willowy. She grinned at me. "Like what you see, gatekeeper? Perhaps I could stay here with you, keep the others in check. You know I'd be good at it." "You enjoy hurt a little too much. If you wish to stay, the forest beyond the chasm has a vacancy. I must tell you, though, those that live there, they will not scare so easily." I kept my eyes fixed on her. Mortimer kept his eyes fixed on her. She looked at me for a while. She turned her attention to Mortimer. She paused before she reverted back to her apparition self. Calm, just regular Sandra sitting in the armchair. "You're all the same." Han was the same. He did not wake until his alarm on his phone went off. He got up and went to the door. That's when he saw my crumpled piece of paper stuck there. I could smell the fear dripping off him. His heart raced. He turned and looked at me. His eyes widened. Beads of sweat formed. I sliced the blade across his throat like Walt had done to me all those years ago. Han flopped to the floor, dead. His eyes closed as the blood left him. I went back to my waiting room and sat there, waiting for the next manager. Only that ginger cat came to get me. He's more than a cat, that thing. Where is it? Hamish has other duties to attend to, I said. There you have it, my story. What will you do now, gatekeeper? Sandra said. Follow me. I got up. Mortimer got up too. He waited for Sandra to get up. This is not negotiable. I looked at her. Sandra got up. I turned left out of the lounge. Sandra followed slowly, Mortimer a few steps behind her. I descended the staircase to the left to the basement floor and turned right down the corridor. Along this wooden corridor, each door looked the same, but each one has a different realm behind it. The only consistency in the corridor is the color of oak wood and the burgundy carpet that runs along it. I walked to the end of the corridor and turned right into another corridor that looked endless. I stopped at the first door on the left. Sandra caught up, shepherded by Mortimer. I opened the door to a set of bushy trenches 12 feet deep in mud and 10 feet high. The walls are made of green thorn bushes that would cut you the instant you touched them.
Flower girl.
A hiss came from deep within the maze. Sandra's eyes widened. They would have screamed if they could.
Flower girl.
The voice said again.
Where are you? I need you to look at me.
The voice said. Only my dad called me that, Sandra said. I nodded. Where did you think he has been all this time? I said. Please, gatekeeper. I gestured to the door. No, please, don't do this. He will find me. I don't want him to find me. How many managers did you take? I said. 5, Sandra said. Seeking retribution. I understand that, but you didn't. You went for Walt after you burned through 3 souls, and then one more after. I shook my head. The house is not so forgiving. Please, enter. I gestured to the maze. Sandra looked at Mortimer, who kept his eyes fixed on her. Mortimer growled. Sandra walked across the threshold.
There you are, my flower girl.
No, Dad, please, no. I closed the door to Sandra's scream. Mortimer trotted straight upstairs. I followed him. As I entered the lounge, Hamish had a single malt waiting on the table next to my chair. He was purring on the arm of my chair. I went over and sat down. Thank you, Hamish. He blinked his eyes. I took a sip. My thoughts drifted. I have seen an assortment of beings, some extremely terrifying just to look at, others meek but could swallow you whole. By far the worst have always been humans who got hurt. They carry a spite within them, makes them hurt others for fun. I am still unsure why. Time to go. I'll sit and think for a bit. See you next Sunday at 11, where my next guest will be making their way to Halfway House 17. Stay safe. Don't die in your sleep. Godspeed.